As I mentioned this year already, British Prime Minister Rishi Sunak wants to deport irregular migrants to Rwanda. The House of Lords has decided against the plan for the time being, though. The second chamber of Parliament in Great Britain has decided against British Prime Minister Rishi Sunak's new asylum law. The Lords in the second chamber, the House of Lords, voted in favour of a motion not to sign the relevant treaty with Rwanda for the time being, and this is likely to delay a vote on the law. And Sunak had previously urged the House of Lords not to stand in the way of the will of the elected House of Commons, as he said. That chamber approved the asylum law last week. The Conservative government's draft plan would deport all migrants who enter Britain irregularly to Rwanda, regardless of their origin. They should ask for asylum in the East African country, which critics accuse of human rights violations. And to this end, Rwanda should be declared a safe third country by law. And a return to Great Britain for those people is therefore impossible. A report had recommended that the contract with Rwanda not be signed until all security requirements were met. The responsible committee of the upper house approved the report with the votes of members of both major parties. Despite the vote, it is expected that the House of Lords will ultimately not block the treaty or the law. However, the upper house, which is known to be critical, could delay the planned schedule, and this would make implementation before the next parliamentary election more difficult. The Social Democratic Labour Party, which is clearly leading in all polls, has already announced that it will not pursue the Rwanda plan any further. And immigration was an important point in the decision for Brexit, though. The withdrawal of the United Kingdom from the European Union, referred to by the portmanteau Brexit, was an extremely complicated but interesting moment in the recent political history of Western Europe. Many issues were touched on in the run-up to the Leave vote, but perhaps none were as central to the debates as immigration and, you remember, controlling our borders. In the 20 years before the Brexit referendum, the UK was increasingly reliant on both skilled and unskilled EU workers and on freedom of movement, particularly in the healthcare sector. Although the British government was almost completely politically paralysed by the Brexit process, it finally ratified the EU withdrawal agreement on January 22nd in 2020, and the UK formally left the EU on January 31st in 2020 and entered a transition period that lasted until December 31st in 2020. And this transition period was business as usual and effectively meant that almost everything continued as if the UK was still part of the EU, even if it was no longer an official member. And this was supposed to allow time to negotiate new agreements between the UK and the EU institutions. On December 31st in 2020, which was called Liberation Day by those in favour of leaving the EU, the transition period ended and a new trade and cooperation agreement between the EU and the United Kingdom came into force, but only roughly regulated relations between the two sides. And this had an impact not only on trade, but also on cross-border migration between the UK and EU member states, as freedom of movement also ended on December 31st in 2020. Since then, EU citizens coming to live and work in the UK will have to apply for a visa in the same way as people from non-EU countries, and they will be subject to a newly introduced points-based immigration system when they try to do that. They have fewer rights than EU migrants previously had under the free movement regulations. For example, for EU citizens wanting to study in the UK, this has become much more expensive, as they now have to pay international tuition fees, visa fees, and a healthcare surcharge, whereas the same rules previously applied to students from EU countries like for British students. Due to restrictions on immigration from EU member states, migration researchers say it is likely that the post-Brexit system will change the nature of migration, including how many people migrate and with what motives and individual characteristics. However, the coronavirus pandemic has impacted data collection, making it currently difficult to assess the changing dynamics of migration movements from the EU to the UK since the end of 2020. Nevertheless, statistics from the Office for National Statistics show that net immigration from the EU fell after the Brexit referendum in June 2016 until 2018. After a short phase of stabilization, the net immigration of EU citizens began to fall again after the outbreak of the corona pandemic at the beginning of 2020, which led to a negative migration balance. More EU citizens left the United Kingdom than immigrated. At the same time, net immigration from non-EU countries has increased. It remains to be seen how Brexit will affect immigration in the long term, of course, but we have some clear signs here. The end of freedom of movement with the EU also affects EU citizens already living in the United Kingdom. However, a key difference from the abolition of freedom of movement regulations with the Commonwealth countries in the 1960s and 70s, for example, is that this time the British government could not act unilaterally. Article 13 of the withdrawal agreement with the EU clearly states, the host state may impose only the restrictions or conditions on the acquisition, maintenance or loss of residence rights provided for in this title. Each EU member state has set up its own system for dealing with a change of status. In the United Kingdom, EU citizens living there, with the exception of Irish nationals, whose freedom of movement rights are regulated by a unilateral free movement of persons agreement, the so-called Common Travel Area, had to register in the so-called EU settlement scheme in order to secure their residency rights. They had until June 30th in 2021 to do so. By this deadline, more than 6 million applications had been submitted. In addition, 822,000 additional applications, so-called late applications, subsequent applications and family members joining, were received by July 1st, 2021 and September 30th in 2022, bringing the total number of applications to more than 6.6 million. However, the system has been controversial and there have been reports of long-term EU citizens being denied a so-called settled status and instead receiving a pre-settled status with fewer rights, and means that an application for settlement status must be submitted again after 5 years. As this is a digital-only status, millions of people in the UK will only be able to prove their rights digitally. This can cause difficulties for those who lack digital literacy or find themselves in precarious living conditions. The EU settlement scheme is just the first example of the digitization of the UK border and immigration system, and by extension of the digitization of verification identification documents and proof of immigration status within the established so-called hostile environment. However, as they are the first group of UK residents unable to provide physical proof of status, EU citizens are at a greater risk of discrimination and denial of access to services. While registered persons should not automatically lose their rights, there is a risk that some will lose their legal status and fall into the hostile environment I just described. And this is reminiscent of the plight of those caught up in the Windrush scandal. And if you want to know more, the next video is right here in the end screen. I'll see you there. I'll be back.